They called him a menace. 3 households, 4 foster placements, and a brief but glorious stint in the mayor's office mailroom. Each time, he came home with more stories than scars, his fur slightly more askew, his eyes reflecting the kind of mischief one doesn't so much teach as inherit. Gerald was, by any measure, too much cat for most. He was orange in the way an autumn tree might be orange, a bit brassy about it, and shaped generously. Like a pumpkin that had learned to walk with silent pride, a pale cream underbelly accompanied a tail that held the unwavering upright tilt of someone who had never once regretted a single decision. His ears twitched like antennae for nonsense. His eyes had the resigned wisdom of a creature who had seen many a living room, conquered each of them, and deemed them all insufficiently interesting. The shelter knew him too well. His carrier was stored just under the receptionist's desk, always ready for retrievals. There had been Mrs. Copeland, who returned him after he allegedly learned how to operate the automatic espresso machine. "He starts it at 3 a.m. exactly," she said, voice shaking. "Then he just stares at me like I'm the weirdo." There was Jeremy, fresh from college, who called the shelter in exasperation. "I had 7 socks before. Now I have 1, and a grudge. Yet, despite that drama, Gerald never lacked admirers. The volunteers adored him, and not just out of pity or hunger for chaos. There was a peculiar charm about him, the way he stared at slow-drifting dust as if it held secrets, or how he'd curl beside someone during an afternoon rainstorm, heavy and purring like a warm loaf of bread. A cat, yes, but maybe something else too. None of his previous misplacements had left him hardened. Gerald was not bitter. If anything, he was curious, endlessly, painfully, whimsically curious. If a door closed, he opened it. If a window was cracked, he slid through. If it rained, he watched. If it snowed, he paraded through it like a tiny Sherpa of joy. The world to Gerald was an unwrapped present, and he intended to paw at every corner. The 3rd time he was returned, a note came with him. A neat index card written in purple ink. It read, "You cannot domesticate." Chaos. Gerald perhaps belongs to the stars. The staff stuck it on the bulletin board beside a watercolor Gerald had accidentally walked across. No one expected him to stay long at the shelter, and yet each return added something to his legend. He'd wander confidently among the cages, pausing to sniff at the scrappy kittens like a weary traveler observing new recruits. Dogs barked, birds chirped. Gerald seemed unimpressed by anything but the ticking radiator and the peculiar elasticity of shoelaces. Then, quite suddenly, came a call. The request was odd. A retirement community on the edge of town, Sunny Pines, had begun a small therapy animal initiative. Dogs had been the go-to, of course, predictable, devoted, boring. But one staff member, inspired by a segment on television about cats lowering blood pressure, suggested a feline companion instead. They asked for someone calm, low, energy, friendly, if perhaps a little ordinary. The shelter assistant paused. "Well," she said, "we've got Gerald." Paperwork was filed. Precautions were detailed carefully. Keep windows shut, feed at the same time, limit unsupervised time, no string toys. He arrived promptly on a Thursday, just after morning tea had been served, in a hand-me-down carrier from a Labrador now happily living in Florida. From the moment Gerald's paw touched the community room carpet, something strange stirred in the air, faintly electric, like the shifting silence before an orchestra finds its first note. The residents were gathered already, wheelchairs ringed in a sunbeam, murmurings of bingo and toast. They stared. Gerald blinked. And then, of course, he vanished around a corner. No introductions, no slow adjustment period, no sitting politely in a lap for exactly 23 seconds as the handler advised. He was gone. Security footage would later confirm. He squirmed deftly between the zippers of his carrier and dropped to the floor in a single elegant motion. A nurse snorted. Marjorie Gaslow, age 92, muttered, "He moves like a pickpocket." By the time someone reached the hallway, Gerald had already explored the reading room, the laundry machines, and one unattended slice of banana bread. Later, Harold O'Flannery, who hadn't left. The E-Solarium in 11 months would swear he saw a tail vanish between bookshelves with the pride of someone late for a cocktail party. No one quite knew yet what they had just received, but something inside Sunny Pines, dusty and long unbothered, had begun to crack open, like sunlight finding old wood, or a fire lit in a hearth that still remembered warmth. Gerald did not reappear that first afternoon. He was gone, vanished, as if absorbed into the spines of aging mystery novels or spirited into some secret warren beneath the wallpaper. A sweep of the hallways revealed naught but knitting needles and tinny echoes. Someone checked behind the vending machine. Someone else half-heartedly tapped on a ficus. "He'll come out when he's hungry," said the receptionist, ever the optimist. By dinner, Sunny Pines had split into camps. The first, pro-cat, whimsical at heart, declared him a free spirit and hero. "Let him explore," said Pearl, who liked watercoloring birds from memory. "He's mapping." The second, skeptical and biscuit-chewing, feared he was breeding in the walls. "You let one in, they open a portal," said Irving, pointing unnecessarily to a vent. That evening, with sunset painting peach lines across the hallway floor, Gerald reemerged, from where no one could say. But there he was, sitting squarely in a planter box in the communal garden as though he had always lived there, soil on his whiskers, a blue glove in his mouth, Marjorie's glove. She recognized it. "The audacity," she whispered, and then she laughed. It began like a poltergeist hiccup, escaping despite her best efforts, then grew. One of those priceless, wheezing, shoulder-rocking laughs that meant something had tilted inside her. She hadn't laughed like that in years. When it finally settled, she looked at the smug, squatting mass of orange fur and said, "All right then, come rob me again tomorrow." The next morning, Gerald was spotted in yoga class. 4 participants, 1 volunteer instructor, and a very snooty golden retriever named Milton. The latter was there for emotional support, but found the entire business degrading. Gerald, however, leaped onto a rolled mat mid-forward bend and sprawled magnificently across the instructors. "Ankle," she yelped. He purred. A delicate pose collapsed. "Well," said Mr. Bertram, "that's the most excitement we've had since Harriet's teeth fell out during chair Zumba." The day progressed in incidents. Gerald inserted himself into a puzzle session, scattering pieces with one deliberate paw. He performed a daring heist of someone's turkey sandwich and was later spotted lounging beneath the piano. Nobody could recall seeing him enter the recreation room. By midweek, Harold had taken to rolling around the courtyard with Gerald perched like royalty on his lap. "I call him Sir Whiskerton III," Harold declared to anyone within earshot, his thick-knuckled hands stroking Gerald's crown. "He's developing counsel." The staff took notes. "Therapeutic outcomes not yet measurable," wrote Nurse Tally in her pad. However, Harold smiled at least 4 times before breakfast. By Thursday, Gerald had appointed himself chief inspector of the Morning Mail. He was frequently found inside the sorting tray, batting envelopes back into disarray. One care assistant watched him select a flyer about low-cholesterol recipes with what she swore was disdain. Gerald prefers brie and crime, deadpanned Eliza, passing by with her walker wrapped in fairy lights. Outside, it rained lightly and often. The gardens turned fragrant with damp. Roses and lavender, which Gerald navigated with the precision of a seasoned botanist/burglar. Things began to transform. The residents adjusted. Chairs were left pulled out ever so slightly, an invitation. A saucer of milk appeared on the reading porch. Unofficially, Marjorie said, in keeping with tradition. The staff, meanwhile, argued semantics. Wasn't this technically still a trial? Was he behaving appropriately? He doesn't bite. Someone offered. He borrows, and the blood pressure of 3 high-anxiety residents had dropped steadily since his arrival. When asked how they felt about this, those residents shrugged, because Gerald now slept on their laps during afternoon game shows, and they feared denying such authority. Now and then, one would say something rather poignant, like Annette, who claimed, "That cat stares through you, like he's remembering something you." Forgot, and then she'd return to her crossword, a little taller in her chair. One morning, Gerald showed up wearing a scarf. No one knew where it came from. Silk, floral blue, tied delicately, like he had been raised by Parisian aunts. He wore it unbothered, tail held high as he trotted into the common room. Someone clapped. He spent 26 minutes that afternoon watching birds through the east window while Harold narrated in dramatic tones. They flirt, Harold claimed, openly, in the honeysuckle. Poker night, once a quiet affair of squinting and tooth-sucking, became loudly contested ever since Gerald began lounging beneath the table. When Clarence accused Lena of bluffing, she merely raised an eyebrow and said, "Ask the cat." Gerald opened one eye, blinked slowly, and the room erupted in laughter. There was something delightfully ungovernable about it all. Gerald had wormed his way into their lives not like a pet, but like a punctuation mark, something that made everything else feel more intentional when he arrived. He didn't sit when asked or perform cute tricks, but he would inexplicably drape himself across someone's newspaper, offering only his purring warmth and the odd biscuit crumb in his fur. It was enough, more than enough. In a place where time often moved with the gentle ache of repetition, Gerald offered chaos dressed in velvet, a creature who broke rules but never hearts, whose presence felt like the warm grin of a friend who hasn't quite confessed the punchline yet. "Wherever he came from," said Marjorie one evening, "I hope they know we're keeping him." It began with a sock. Not a noteworthy sock, mind you. Not lucky or cashmere. Not even particularly clean. Just a sock. White, slightly discolored, last seen on the foot of Irving. Tobias during his Tuesday walk. He returned from said promenade, shoeless, confused, and slightly annoyed. "I know I wore two," he insisted, pointing at his unclothed left foot. "I always wear two. The balance is off otherwise." The staff assured him he did in fact leave with both. Irving, however, was certain. That cat's involved. The next day, Edith Bloom misplaced her glasses, not the backup pair she wore on a chain, her duds speckled. The ones with the emerald flecks on the rim that she never left lying around. Room sweep, nothing. Drawer check, nothing. Gerald, they noted, had been seen exiting her room earlier that morning, tail high, eyes guilty. Then it was Harold's crossword pencil, gone mid-Sudoku. "Still warm when I last held it," he told anyone who'd listen. The stories piled higher than the recycling bin. A knitting needle without its pair. One of Eliza's false eyelashes. Yes, just the one, Marjorie's denture paste. A half-completed jigsaw piece that turned up 3 days later in somebody's slipper. Even Milton's decorative bow tie, usually fastened neatly around his smug golden neck, vanished to his enduring shame. A pattern emerged, if only in absurdity. Gerald, it seemed, was lifting items. Petty theft, small-time cat burglary, committed under broad daylight and without any apparent motive, but mischief. And yet, no one quite wanted it to stop. Soon, wanted posters began appearing on the main bulletin board, one right between announcements for Tuesday Tai Chi and new meal plan options. Gerald's face, captured mid-yawn and scribbled over with a crude bandit mask, smiled out beneath the caption, "Guilty as charged. Approach with tickles." It became addictive, like a scavenger hunt without rules or prizes, only slightly more denture. Related, Eliza, unofficial leader of the resistance, declared war. Or, at the very least, a formal surveillance effort, launching what became known as the Gerald Watch Patrol. She repurposed an old bingo board as a suspect chart, complete with pushpins and red thread. "This is not amateur hour," she said sternly, wrapping her walker in caution tape. Volunteers were enrolled. Observation shifts were assigned. Gerald, blissfully unaware, or perhaps completely aware and delighting in the drama, continued his campaign. What he did with the items remained a mystery. There were no visible stashes, no rattling under beds, no dragging beneath furniture. When questioned, Gerald merely stared, unblinking, as if none of it mattered, as if the act of taking was in itself the point. Still, the Watch Patrol documented everything: theft times, likely motives. One young assistant even created a spreadsheet labeled Feline Larceny Q3 Metrics. "I think he's building something," grumbled Irving, polishing one remaining slipper. "A throne, maybe. Out of stolen forks." The absurdity grew delightful. Residents started preemptively announcing their losses like news anchors. "Breaking: Marjorie's left earring has gone rogue. Suspect is orange, four-legged, and silent when judged." Others embraced the chaos. Lena began attaching tiny notes to objects she suspected might be targeted. Her hand cream bore a message: "For soft paws only." Her knitting yarn read, "Not edible." And yet every new theft was met with laughter. Hardy hars that rolled down the hallway, sometimes wheezy, sometimes surprised. The kind of laughter that shook off more dust than words ever could. It wasn't just about the missing items anymore. Something had shifted. The days had bloomed. Somehow, there was mischief rustling beneath the silence now, like wind through old library pages. Eyes twinkled a few beats longer. People lingered in hallways, curious to see if a bandit-capturing caper might unfold. Even those who had mostly kept to their rooms inched out of their corners to speculate, to observe, to wonder if Gerald might dabble in thievery on their watch. And Gerald, puffed up on legend, trailing feathers and yarn behind him like the scent of myth, carried on. He left no notes, no demands, no grand gestures, only the faint scent of lavender from the stolen sachets, the drag mark of tweed across a freshly vacuumed rug, and the knowledge that somewhere at this very moment, someone was realizing their slippers had been replaced with a deadpan pair of tuna cans and laughing harder than they had in years. One quiet Tuesday evening, Jonathan, the janitor with a fondness for crossword puzzles and a thermos full of chicken soup, noticed the flower shed door swinging gently open in the breeze. It should have been locked, always was, especially after Henry from maintenance had found the raccoon inside that one time. But tonight, the door gave a polite creak as it moved, like it had something to confess. Curiosity outweighed protocol, as it tends to do in places where not. Much else changes. Jonathan approached, his shoes crunching silently over the gravel path laced with evening dew. He pushed the door gently. What he saw inside made him stop in his tracks. There, amidst a regal sprawl of knitted Afghans, crossword books, and half a pair of orthopedic slippers, lay Gerald, asleep, nestled among his spoils with the serene satisfaction of an art thief napping beneath the Mona Lisa. One paw rested triumphantly atop what could only be described as Eliza's novelty tea cozy. It was warm in the shed, not artificially so, but with a kind of lived-in coziness, as though the very air had resigned itself to being owned by a cat. Crumpled gloves, socks of every pattern, 3 pill organizers, all empty, a heavy magnifying glass, and somehow a garden gnome's hat were strewn about with the precision of purposeful chaos. Jonathan backed out slowly, pulling the door shut with reverent quiet. The next morning, the rumors leaked like tea through a paper napkin. By mid-morning, Gerald's secret lair had become phrase of the hour. The residents, one by one, made their way to the garden path, not to interfere, but to peer in. Quietly, respectfully. Like visitors at a cathedral, curated by a kleptomaniacal saint. Marjorie let out a laugh so sudden that she startled a dove off the roof. "That's my glove," she whispered, pressing a hand to her chest like it had finally come home. "And Harold's crossword book. He's been writing angry letters to the editor for weeks. Crossword theft is the highest caliber of crime," Harold muttered, though with a smile that fought him all the way to his ears. Eliza arrived last, armed with her clipboard of red thread notes and a certain thrilling indignation. Inside, she saw the full extent of the stash. her. Surveillance dossier had not been quite so thorough. She exhaled a single word: respect. There was no threat of discipline, no wagging fingers or trip to the vet's office. Instead, they began adding to it. At first, it was subtle: a small pack of tissues with a tiny post-it for feline sniffles, a purple yarn ball placed delicately beside a mystery novel with the last chapter missing. Even Milton, that eternally judgmental Labrador, was found. Pawing nervously at the shed door one evening with a bacon-flavored chew toy, the collection grew. It became a game, almost a ritual, an anonymous contribution to the Museum of Mischief. A way to say, I see you, chaos, and I appreciate your aesthetic. Someone stitched a pillow that read, Gerald's Emporium of Unreasonably Acquired Goods, and left it atop the pile. Edith painted a small sign in calligraphy, no touching unless you are orange. And entitled, when the mayor's assistant visited Sunny Pines for her monthly check-in, Gerald was asleep atop the artifact pile, a crocheted crown perched askew on his head. Don't wake him, Marjorie said solemnly. He holds dominion now. The assistant, unsure of protocol where a seated cat Muse was involved, apologized to nobody and backed away slowly. And so the shed remained, a secret known by all and guarded by none. Whenever someone lost something, the first response was no longer dread. It was, have you checked the cathedral? Gerald, for his part, never confessed. When asked directly, he would blink in silent command, as if to say, what lair? He maintained an air of plausible deniability so rich it deserved its own wing. Yet as spring unfurled petals in the planters and winds slipped through the hedges, the real truth took root like ivy on old brick. It wasn't about the Engs. It was about what they meant, these acts of gentle nonsense, this curated exhibition of the wonderfully mundane. He had transformed their world into a softly blooming absurdity, and somehow, in that snug shed full of junk and joy, he'd given everyone something precious back, a shared joke, a stolen pencil, a reason to peek through a half-open door and feel, if only for a moment, a giggle stirring in the chest like mischief in bloom. It started with a sniffle, not dramatic, not the sort of cinematic weeping that makes others rush in. Just a soft, involuntary sound at the far end of the west hallway as the afternoon light slanted through tall, dust-frilled windows. A sound that could have been mistaken for the radiator or the shuffle of slippers, except that Gerald heard it. He had just emerged from a nap under the library radiator, bits of thieved yarn hitching a ride on his tail, one eye opened, then the other. His nostrils caught something more curious than the usual soup and linen drift. Something quieter, something aching. Mr. Linwood wasn't particularly known around Sunny Pines, which was part of the point. He arrived after New Year's, quietly, carting one suitcase, a deep frown, and 0 visitors. He'd chosen a room at the end of the hall, distant from nearly everything, except the emergency exit and the unused coat closet. There had been a note in his file, widowed, former history professor, enjoys coffee, dislikes noise, and perhaps more poignantly, still adjusting. Gerald rounded the corner in absolute silence, moving not like a cat, but like inevitability itself. He padded toward the door, left open just a crack. From within, the sniffle again, followed by the rustle of tissue and the kind of sigh that sounded like something collapsing gently. Inward, the hallway was empty, the room was dim, and Gerald, clearly defying all known etiquette and privacy codes, pushed the door a few inches with the boldness granted only to those thoroughly immune to shame. Mr. Linwood did not notice the intrusion. He sat in a recliner by the window, a photo album open across his lap. His eyes, bleary and glass-pinned, gazed at something already past. The light hit his face tenderly. A caress he didn't acknowledge. His glasses had slid to the bridge of his nose, and on the floor beside him were scattered tissues and a book resting face down. Gerald hopped lightly onto the bed, then onto the padded armrest. He gave the album a subtle glance, black and white photos of a woman with wide eyes and a lopsided smile, sometimes with cats balanced on her shoulders, sometimes mid-laugh. Then gently, utterly uninvited, he settled on Mr. Linwood's feet. Not the lap, not the shoulder, just the feet. 2 old cotton-clad feet in orthopedic slippers that hadn't moved in hours. The old man didn't startle. He looked down, eyes flickering, mouth parting just slightly. It took him a moment to understand, and in that moment, something eased in his spine. The tissue slipped from his fingers to the rug. "Well," he said hoarsely, "aren't you bold?" Gerald did not reply. He merely repositioned, pressing heavier into the shoes, like he'd always meant to be there. After a few minutes, Linwood picked up the photo album and continued flipping, and for the first time, he spoke aloud. "That one's Margie," he said to no one in particular, or maybe directly to Gerald. "She called cats little emperors, said they deigned to stay with us only." Between other appointments, Gerald blinked. She had 3, Bonneville, Juniper, and Bebe, the terrors, used to steal onion rolls off the counter. He chuckled, surprised by the sound of his own voice. By the end of the week, staff caught on. It became part of the unspoken rhythms of Sunny Pines. Each afternoon, somewhere between snack trays and Wheel of Fortune, Gerald would vanish. And if you followed your ears or your heart correctly, you'd find him in the West Wing, tucked across Mr. Linwood's slippers, tail twitching softly during pauses in spoken memories. No one disturbed them. Nurse Tally did once, knocking softly to deliver an extra blanket. She later reported she heard Mr. Linwood reading aloud, not to her, but to Gerald. His voice rose and fell with the cadences of story, like a tide wearing away old silence. "I think he's remembering how to speak," she said afterward, her clipboard briefly forgotten. Others noticed it too, how Linwood lingered at lunch now, how his nods to fellow residents mutated into full sentences, how he drifted toward community puzzles and once even corrected Irving's misremembered Civil War general, politely but firmly. "Gerald's got an ancient soul," Linwood mused one windy evening as they sat in matching silence. "Knows when to chatter and when to simply be present. Same as Margie." He said it not with sadness, but with quiet conviction, the kind reserved for things that only the bones understand. That phrase made its way around the community like wind through lace. "An ancient soul," murmured Marjorie as she watched Gerald stare at the fireplace with unnatural stillness. "Probably older than any of us," smirked Harold. "And still better groomed." The quote was later added to Gerald's unofficial biography, a scrap of paper taped beside his lair in the garden shed. Gerald, slightly divine, soul age, unknown. And Mr. Linwood? He smiled now. Not broadly, not often, but enough. Enough that even on the days when the sky remained cloud-heavy and the radio played songs from anniversaries past, there was still the sound of faint, vibrating purrs warming his ankles. No miracles, no sudden transformation, just the day's worth of grace tucked into a paw-shaped presence. It started as passing joke from Clarence during dinner, something about how Gerald should be given the key to the city, or at the very least a commemorative day in his honor. Marjorie snorted into her soup. Lena raised an eyebrow and said, "Why not give him a birthday?" Everyone paused. The silence buzzed, not with skepticism, but with opportunity. Harold, catching on almost instantly, clapped his hand on the table. Yes, a proper fete, with streamers and prawns. By dessert, it was decided Gerald would have a birthday. No one knew when he was actually born, of course. But that seemed beside the point. "We'll make it Thursday," Pearl said decisively, licking the corner of her napkin. "Feels like a Thursday kind of cat." And so preparations began. There was ribbon cutting and cake planning and talk of banners. Harold began penning a speech with a gravitas he hadn't summoned since his Navy days. Marjorie commandeered the arts and crafts cupboard, emerging hours later with tiny cone-shaped hats that barely fit over half a banana. Lena offered to cook, strategically vetoed by 3 residents and a nurse. Someone unearthed a party playlist from the old PA system. Edith organized a cat fact corner station, bemused and delighted to discover how many ways there were to reference Verbalzen. Classical literature. The staff, initially hesitant to endorse what was rapidly snowballing into an event with catering, relented when Nurse Tally, clipboard in hand, noted a sharp uptick in both blood pressure stability and general mood scores. Gerald, for his part, remained blissfully elusive during the setup. He watched from shadows, from windowsills, from the top of the grandfather clock in the music room. Occasionally, he'd swipe at a streamer or nap in the middle of the craft table, but mostly he observed, like royalty reviewing a coronation in progress. The day arrived with sunlight tucked neatly into every corner of the lawn. Residents filed into the garden in Sunday best, a flurry of pearls, shawls, suspenders, and orthopedic sandals. The courtyard had been transformed. Paper lanterns fluttered from trees. Tables were dotted with centerpieces, each featuring a small portrait of Gerald in increasingly absurd costumes, and the fountain burbled in polite celebration. A banner stretched across the trellis. "Happy birthday, Gerald, our favorite illegal resident." There was cake, of course, tuna and shrimp smushed artfully into a tiered affair that Marjorie described as positively grotesque but fragrant. It was topped with a single sardine and a birthday candle that produced faint sparkles instead of flame. Gerald arrived 20 minutes late, as was his custom. Around his neck was the absurdly miniature cravat someone had stitched 2 weeks prior. It had polka dots. It matched nothing. It was, somehow, perfect. The moment he entered the space, applause broke out. Laughter, too. Gentle, Ellie laughter that quietly filled all the empty pockets of air. A few residents dabbed at their eyes, claiming allergies. Gerald paused a moment, posed even, then made a slow loop around the perimeter of the courtyard. Harold gave his speech perched on a stool that had once held a bird bath. "My fellow humans," he began, thumping his cane once for effect. "On this most hallowed of occasions, we gather not in jest. We gather in reverence, in gratitude, in awe of a feline whose crimes and affections have united us more thoroughly than even the great pancake debate of '98. There was giggling, some polite snort chokes. A throat was cleared. "Gerald," he continued, eyes shining, "you are at once a rogue and a monk, a poet and a pickpocket. May your paws remain fleet, your whiskers dry, and your heart ever ambivalent toward authority. Happy birthday, dear imp." The applause that followed was louder then. Appropriate, which made it precisely right. A framed painting was unveiled just before the jello came out. It was a portrait of Gerald, regal in a Renaissance doublet, with skeptical eyes and a paw resting on a scroll. "The patron saint of shenanigans," read the plaque. Marjorie grinned. "Now that'll startle the new Nos interns." The picture was hung immediately above the fireplace in the common lounge. No one dared use that chair anymore. Gerald's throne, they called it. Photos were taken, with great care and terrible lighting. Gerald blinked in half of them and looked deeply insulted in the rest. Someone knitted him a birthday sash. He wore it backward, dragging it like a cape. And all day, laughter rose and fell like music missing its lyrics, but sure of its rhythm. The party wound down with slices of fruitcake and tales retold in exaggerated tones. Someone insisted. They'd seen Gerald type something on a computer once. Someone else claimed he'd reorganized their medication drawer by lunar phase. Each story more implausible, more lovingly absurd than the last. And through it all, Gerald slinked and sprawled and blinked his slow, magnetic blink, collecting compliments like coins in a velvet bag. As the sun dipped behind the hedges, casting a soft golden hue across the marigolds, someone asked, "How old do we think he is?" Mr. Linwood chuckled quietly from under his sun hat. "Timeless," he said. "You don't measure that kind of magic in years." No one argued, because in a world of elastic time and fading memory, it seemed only fitting that their favorite whiskered mystery had no beginning worth noting, and, as they all hoped, no end worth entertaining. The rain came softly that morning, a hush upon the garden paths, barely more than a whisper in the lavender, a mist along the hedges. It didn't keep Gerald inside. Nothing ever did for long. He emerged from some improbable place, damp-footed and unimpressed, pausing briefly at the edge of the patio to regard the drizzle with his usual expression, mild disdain tinged with philosophical surrender. Inside, the world moved gently. Newspapers rustled, toast was buttered with ancient precision, and someone let out a long, satisfied sigh over a cup of weak coffee. Gerald, paws leading silent prints along the tiled hallway, made his usual rounds without urgency. He paused briefly beside Nurse Tally's desk, where someone had left a bowl of wrapped candies and a late-arriving tax form. Gerald batted the form onto the floor, considered unwrapping a peppermint, and then moved along. His duties, it seemed, did not include sugar theft before noon. In the common room, a chess game had been abandoned mid-check. Gerald hopped onto the side table and nudged a black rook into a cup of lukewarm tea. No one protested. In fact, no one noticed, except Edith, who glanced up from her armchair, smiled in that faraway way she now did when remembering names, and whispered, "That's checkmate, you rascal." The portrait above the fireplace watched all with its usual suspicion. Gerald in regal attire, surveying a painted kingdom of nonsense. A small paper crown rested just beneath it, slightly crushed. Someone had left it there after the birthday, unwilling to throw it out, unable to imagine it belonging anywhere else. There were new staff sometimes. They'd ask things, their fresh clipboards brimming with protocol. Does anyone officially own him? No. Does he have behavior issues? Yes. What's his purpose here? That last one was never answered directly. Someone would usually shrug or smile or say, "You'll figure it out." And in time, they would. When Gerald padded beside them on cold mornings, when he appeared inexplicably, just as someone's hand trembled too much to pour tea. When loneliness grew bulbous in the corners of rooms and he slinked in to sit and stay until it receded again. Linwood had started keeping a saucer by his chair, not always milk, sometimes broth, sometimes water with a hint of lemon. His wife used to say cats liked pretending they were in the south of France. Gerald accepted these offerings with distasteful dignity, like a prince indulging a local custom. One Thursday afternoon, the mayor herself arrived for a photo opportunity. Something about small communities and therapy initiatives. Gerald did not appear. They waited, took pictures with residents, ate cake, read a plaque. Still, no cat. Only after the entourage had left, and the balloons had started their slow wilt, did Gerald reemerge. From under a couch, most said. Or perhaps from the mysterious third laundry chute, long since disconnected. He found the leftover cake and sat beside it, eyes narrowed. "You've missed the mayor," someone said. Gerald sneezed twice and bit into a shrimp canapé, entirely unfazed. The seasons turned. Summer softened into the kind of glorious early autumns where the leaves change slowly. Caught mid-sentence between green and flame, Gerald took to sunning himself on the window ledges where the heat pooled and dust danced in golden shafts. When winter came, residents crocheted him a tiny scarf, which he refused to wear. Harold hung it on the back of the piano. "Symbolic warmth," he declared. At some point, someone added Gerald's name to the directory, not in the pet list, but in the resident log. Room everywhere. Dietary needs. Selective. Family. Yes. And every few weeks, someone new would arrive. Quiet, laden, tentative. And somehow, without plan or permission, Gerald would find his way to their door. He'd enter simply, no speech, no tail flourish, just a warm loaf of a body settling near enough to be noticed, but far enough to let sadness unfold respectfully. "Do you do this for everyone?" One new arrival asked him. He blinked once. In Gerald terms, maybe. Time, which forgets much, never really forgot Gerald. His face appeared on newsletters for no reason at all. A latte fame art class used his silhouette as inspiration. At least 2 Christmas plays now featured a wise orange beast as a narrating role. And when Annette passed, she left behind a request: burial with a photograph of Gerald tucked in beside her wedding portrait. Nothing about him was ever official, but nothing about him ever needed to be. There were still thefts now and then: a missing tea towel, an antique thimble, once mysteriously an entire coffee filter basket. Residents would smirk. "The lair's still active," they'd murmur. "The curator hasn't retired." And in the quietest hour of a particular ordinary Tuesday, when the air was still and the plants in the corridor leaned into the sunlight just so, Gerald was seen, seated in the garden, tail twitching faintly, eyes following. The flight of 2 sparrows dancing like mirages through the hedge. He did not move, he didn't pounce, only watched. And in that stillness, faintly feline, wholly poetic, there was something echoed back. The hush of laughter long ago, the timbre of stories retold, the breath of lives intertwined by a whiskered thread. Where others may have seen just a stray, Sunny Pines had seen something else, a question mark shaped like a cat, a small, glorious rebellion against the dull, and above all, a heart no one wanted to give back.